Mistakes even financial celebrities made are often glossed over in popular storytelling, yet they are the most instructive parts of every legendary career. When we strip away the myth of flawless genius, what remains is far more useful evidence that even the most disciplined, intelligent, and powerful figures misjudged risk, misunderstood context, or let emotions slip into decision-making. Trading and investment literature, when read, honestly reveals a humbling truth. Great financial success is not built by avoiding mistakes altogether, but by surviving them, learning from them, and preventing a single error from becoming a permanent collapse. One of the most famous examples is Warren Buffett's early avoidance of technology stocks, particularly his long reluctance to invest in companies like Microsoft, Amazon, or Google. For years, this was framed as wisdom, staying within his circle of competence. In hindsight, it was also a missed opportunity of enormous scale. Buffett himself has openly acknowledged this as a mistake. The lesson here is subtle, but critical discipline can harden into rigidity if it is not periodically re-examined. A strength when over-applied becomes a limitation. What makes Buffett exceptional is not that he avoided error, but that he later admitted it without defensiveness and adjusted his framework rather than clinging to identity. George Soros, often portrayed as the embodiment of market intuition, also made costly mistakes rooted in conviction. After his famous success betting against the British pound, Soros suffered significant losses in other macro trades where his thesis was early or incomplete. What distinguishes Soros is not the absence of error, but the speed of recognition. He famously reduced risk dramatically the moment doubt entered his mind, even before losses became obvious. The lesson here is that being wrong is less dangerous than staying wrong. Flexibility, not brilliance, preserved his fortune. Jesse Livermore's story is perhaps the most painful example of all. He correctly anticipated major market crashes and made fortunes multiple times, yet he ultimately lost everything. His mistakes were not analytical, they were behavioral. After success, he violated his own rules, increased leverage, and allowed ego to override discipline. Livermore's life teaches a lesson many prefer to ignore. Knowing the right thing is not the same as being able to do it repeatedly. Mastery requires emotional regulation after winning, not just after losing. Even John D. Rockefeller, often remembered as relentlessly disciplined, made early speculative mistakes that nearly cost him his business. These experiences shaped his later obsession with stability and control. His eventual dominance was built not on early perfection, but on scars that taught him the cost of volatility. The lesson here is that early mistakes, when survived, often become the foundation of later restraint. What looks like caution and maturity is often earned through youthful error. Ray Dalio, the architect of one of the world's most sophisticated investment frameworks, has spoken openly about a near-career-ending mistake in the early 1980s, when he was wrong about economic conditions and lost so much money he had to lay off staff. That experience forced him to confront overconfidence and the danger of unchallenged belief. It led to the culture of radical transparency and stress testing that later defined Bridgewater. The lesson is clear. Systems built to catch mistakes often emerge only after painful failure exposes their necessity. Across all these examples, a common pattern emerges. The mistake itself is rarely the defining moment. The response is. Financial celebrities who endured did three things consistently. They contained losses, so one mistake did not become fatal. They reflected honestly instead of rationalizing, and they adapted their process rather than blaming circumstances. Those who failed permanently often did the opposite. They defended ego-increased risk to recover faster, or refused to question assumptions. Another important insight is that many mistakes came from success, not ignorance. overconfidence after winning, pressure to maintain reputation, and the illusion of control all played roles. This teaches a counterintuitive lesson: the period after success is often more dangerous than the period after failure. Financial celebrities who lasted treated success as a risk factor, not as proof of invincibility. What we ultimately learn from the mistakes of financial icons is not caution in the narrow sense, but respect for fragility. Markets are complex adaptive systems. No framework remains permanently correct. No individual is immune to bias. The goal, therefore, is not to build a life or career free of error, but to build one that can absorb error without breaking. And it is precisely here, when we stop viewing mistakes as embarrassing detours and start seeing them as structural components of long-term success, that the stories of financial celebrities become most valuable, because they remind us that greatness in finance is not defined by being right all the time, but by staying solvent, reflective, and disciplined long enough for learning to compound into wisdom, and for wisdom, rather than ego, to guide the next decision. And this deeper understanding of error has not yet fully reached its end, because when mistakes are reframed as structural rather than accidental, a deeper pattern comes into focus, one that applies not only to legends, but to anyone who aspires to longevity in finance. The second layer of learning from these errors is not about avoiding specific scenarios, but about building habits and systems that make mistakes survivable, instructive, and ultimately diminishing in impact over time. This is where the stories of financial celebrities stop being history and start becoming mirrors. One of the clearest lessons is that scale magnifies error. As capital influence or reputation grows small, misjudgments carry larger consequences. Many financial icons underestimated this transition. Early in their careers, flexibility and intuition served them well. Later, the same traits became dangerous without structure. Livermore's downfall is the most extreme example, but milder versions appear everywhere. The lesson is that what works at one level often breaks at another. Systems must evolve as scale changes, otherwise yesterday's strengths quietly become tomorrow's liabilities. Another recurring mistake among financial celebrities was narrative attachment. Once a story had worked, it was tempting to reuse it without sufficient skepticism. Soros warned repeatedly about this trap, yet even he was not immune to it. Dalio's early failure stemmed from believing too strongly in a single macro narrative without enough opposing views. The corrective insight here is powerful. Every belief needs a counterweight. The most resilient investors deliberately expose their ideas to criticism, dissent, and stress testing, not because they enjoy doubt, but because doubt keeps them adaptive. There is also a lesson about timing humility. Many mistakes occurred not because the thesis was wrong, but because it was early. In markets, being early is indistinguishable from being wrong until it suddenly is not, and capital does not care about philosophical correctness. Buffett's missed tech investments and Soros's premature macro calls both illustrate this. The takeaway is not to abandon conviction, but to size conviction appropriately. Time risk is real. Even correct ideas can be fatal if they are carried with excessive exposure while waiting for reality to catch up. Perhaps the most underappreciated lesson from these mistakes is the danger of identity fusion. When success becomes part of who someone believes they are, changing course feels like self-betrayal. This psychological trap explains why some icons held losing positions too long or resisted admitting error publicly. The most durable figures learned to separate identity from ideas. They could discard a thesis without discarding their sense of self. This emotional flexibility, more than intelligence, allowed them to keep learning after success. Another important insight is that recovery is often quieter than collapse. When financial celebrities corrected mistakes successfully, it rarely looked dramatic. Risk was reduced. Positions were closed. Focus narrowed. Ego stepped back. There were no speeches, no declarations, no public confessions until long after the fact. This teaches a practical lesson. Recovery does not require heroics. It requires restraint. The urge to win it back or prove correctness is what turns ordinary mistakes into existential ones. Looking across these stories, a simple framework emerges. Mistakes are inevitable. What matters is whether they are allowed to compound. Financial celebrities who endured designed their lives and processes to cap downside, preserve optionality, and ensure that learning continued even after pain. Those who failed treated mistakes as threats to ego rather than signals to adapt. The difference is subtle in the moment, but enormous over decades. And so the real takeaway from the mistakes of financial celebrities is not fear, but responsibility. Responsibility to question success as rigorously as failure. Responsibility to update beliefs without waiting for catastrophe. Responsibility to build structures that assume imperfection rather than deny it. When this responsibility is embraced, mistakes lose their power to define outcomes. They become inputs rather than verdicts. In the end, studying the errors of financial icons reveals something deeply reassuring. Even the best were wrong. Often. What made them exceptional was not foresight, but resilience. They stayed solvent long enough to learn. They stayed humble enough to adjust. And they stayed disciplined enough to ensure that no single mistake, however painful, could erase the work of decades. That is the real lesson they leave behind. Not how to be right, but how to remain standing when you are not. And it is this quiet mastery of error, more than any winning trade or brilliant insight, that ultimately separates legends from cautionary tales.